Hi, hello, how are we all? Long time no see. If you've been watching my channel for a while, then you might know that I worked in health policy before starting med school. But something that I haven't shared yet on this platform is that I've been really heavily involved in writing and journalism, specifically campus journalism. During my first 2 years of med school, I actually served as the senior op-ed editor for the Chicago Policy Review. In this role, I worked with UChicago students from across the graduate schools to refine and publish their opinion editorial articles. I've been really excited and encouraged to see more and more medical students getting engaged in policy issues. So I wanted to take the opportunity to share some of my tips and tricks on how to write and publish an op-ed, both because I think writing and storytelling is a really important way to advocate for the social changes we believe in, and also because I think op-eds have a fairly distinct and specific writing style that not a lot of students, especially medical students, end up learning about. So whether you're a medical student or if you just have some issue that you really want to say something about, today we're going to be going over what an op-ed is, how to approach the op-ed writing process, the key parts of an op-ed, and finally some advice for pitching and publishing your article. So really briefly, an op-ed or an opinion editorial article is a short piece of writing with a really clearly defined point of view. Unlike a lot of other types of writing, like academic writing, op-eds typically have a really strong sense of voice, oftentimes because the writer has some sort of expertise or experience on the issue that's being discussed. Oftentimes too, there's a call to action built into the piece, something that the reader is encouraged or advocated to do. So now that we know the basics of what an op-ed is, we're gonna chat a little bit about the op-ed writing process. I actually made a little worksheet for y'all on Scrintal, which is a note-taking and brainstorming app that I've been using for the past couple of weeks. They're kind enough to be sponsoring this portion of the video. If you've watched my planner setup video, then you'll know that I'm not a very naturally organized person. And that honestly goes for my writing process as well. I have all these scattered sticky notes on my desk. I have snippets of things written in the notes app on my phone. So I'm typically a little skeptical of productivity apps. I'm a little old-fashioned. I have really little patience for things that look pretty but don't work well. But I've honestly been really enjoying using Scrintal. The platform is really intuitive and easy. It's also card-based, so it's kind of like a digital recreation of my little sticky notes. And I think Scrintal is particularly well suited for creative projects like op-eds, but also research projects. I have a good number of writing projects that I'm hoping to work on throughout my M4 year, so I'm excited to see how using Scrintal will help facilitate my progress. So all that being said, here is my Scrintal board worksheet. Over here on the left, we have the questions that you should be thinking about as you start your writing process. And then on the right, I have some text on the components of an op-ed. These leftmost columns are kind of generic descriptions of things to think about when writing any op-ed, and I've included examples in these right columns here, drawing on one of my own op-eds that was published after an Asian American UChicago student was killed after a mugging last year. I'll link to the full piece in the description box below, but I do want to say that this op-ed is a little untraditional. It's definitely longer than 700 words, and it's a lot less digestible than the typical op-ed you might see in a newspaper. So I've also linked to another op-ed example that one of my amazing classmates wrote. I worked with her in structuring and editing this piece, and it ended up getting published in the Chicago Sun-Times. It's a really great and important piece, so I would definitely recommend that you read it. And it's also a very quintessential example of what the op-ed writing style looks like. So to get back to our worksheet, when you start writing an op-ed, it helps to first know exactly what you want to say, to have a thesis of sorts. And that's not something that necessarily needs to be explicitly stated within the text of the piece, but it's something that you should feel really clear on throughout the writing process. In addition to knowing what the point of the piece ultimately is, you should also have a clear idea of what you want the reader to take away from the piece. How do you want them to take the information you're presenting and move forward with their life? Do you want them to go volunteer? Do you want them to vote a certain way? All these questions are useful to have answers to even before you sit down in front of that Word document and start writing. So in my case, I wanted to make the point that the root cause of violent crime is economic and racial injustice, and that pushes to increase policing in my neighborhood would not make anyone more safe. including the Asian American community. So kind of going hand in hand with the questions of, what you want your reader to take away from the piece. You should also have a good idea of who your ideal audience is. Who are you writing this for? Is the issue that you're speaking on specific to a neighborhood or a city, or is it national? Do you hope to speak to, for example, other medical students or other members of the medical community, or are you hoping to speak to a more general audience? Knowing the answer to this question is not only useful in figuring out the level of detail, the level of jargon that you want to use, but also can be useful in figuring out what kind of publication you would want this piece to land at. In terms of my example, because the shooting and the discourse around policing that arose in its aftermath was all specific to the Hyde Park and UChicago community, I really wanted my piece to be targeted towards the campus community specifically. Even though I wanted to speak really specifically to the UChicago community, this shooting happened around the time where an increasing number of Asian Americans were experiencing violence and harassment on the streets, and a number of Asian American communities across the country were calling for greater policing. I also wanted to touch upon some of these more national trends. So now that you know what you want to say and who you want to say it to, you should also have a good idea of who you are, why you are the right person to write this story. Oftentimes, the most successful and convincing op-eds are from writers that have unique insight into the issue at hand. So in my example, like the student who was killed, I'm Chinese American, I'm a UChicago student. So I felt like I had a unique position, both because I could speak to members of my own community that might be interested in increasing policing, as well as outsiders to my community who might be using Asian Americans as a way to justify greater policing in the Hyde Park neighborhood. Finally, you should have an idea of why this piece matters now. What's going on in the news that has raised this issue for you? What conversation are you hoping to participate in writing this piece? For my piece, as I've kind of already mentioned, there was an intense period of dialogue around policing on campus during this time, and I was hoping to contribute to that conversation. So once you've answered all those questions and gotten a clear idea for what you want to accomplish in writing this piece, it's time to actually write it. So here is a really simple 3-part outline for the basic parts of an op-ed. Once you get comfortable with this format, you can of course play around with things, make sure that things fit with the logical flow of your argument. But in general, op-eds will start with what's called a lead. This is the opening of your piece. It's meant to hook in the reader. It's kind of where you can put in personal anecdotes. And here's an example of the lead that I used in my piece. I made a reference to the Atlanta spa shootings that had happened earlier that year, as well as a student that had been killed a few weeks prior to this piece being published. And I also spoke a bit about my personal experience being Asian American. Moving on from the beginning of the piece, there's something that's called a nut graph. It's a really funny name, but it basically is supposed to reference the nutshell paragraph, the nut graph. It is a paragraph that summarizes your central argument, often the transition between the lead and the rest of the article. If you've done enough self-reflection and brainstorming and planning ahead of time, then writing this paragraph should be fairly straightforward. So here's just an example of my nut graph. You can pause to read it, but I won't go into it. It kind of gets at all the things that I was speaking about earlier. Finally, a good op-ed should have data and evidence. It should convince the reader that the information you're presenting is trustworthy, correct, believable. So in my article, I briefly touched upon the history of the UChicago campus police. I spoke about economic inequities between different neighborhoods within Chicago, and I also cited studies demonstrating that increased policing does not actually reduce violent crime. One thing to note about the op-ed format is that these are not academic papers, so you don't have to cite your sources in the way that you would for a class. It's usually enough to include a hyperlink to the specific source that you're citing. If you're curious about what I mean by that, you can definitely take a look at either of the pieces that I linked below. So I'll link to this Screental board we've been looking at in the description box. I think you should be able to view it without an account, but if you guys do decide to check out Screental, I have a 50% off discount code and a link that I'll include in the description box. And that'll allow you to actually directly add your info into this worksheet just by adding a column and filling out your thoughts. So now that we've talked about how to brainstorm, write, structure your op-ed, I want to talk a little bit about publishing. My first tip is a little self-explanatory, but the best thing that you could possibly do when either pitching a story to an editor or submitting a fully written piece is to read the submission guidelines. Your piece might be fantastic, but if it's not formatted in the right way, if it's not sent to the right email address, then it will never get read. Kind of similarly, it really helps to be familiar with the publication. Even if you're not a regular reader, definitely read a few of the articles that are published. Oftentimes, publications have a particular angle or brand. For example, Vox does a lot of explanatory journalism, or Stat is kind of targeted towards a medical audience. Get a good sense for the kinds of pieces that they want to publish and really play up how your piece might align with the mission of the publication. My next piece of advice is to email editors directly when possible. Journalists and editors often have their emails just freely available online, in their Twitter bios, on their websites, on the publication websites. Definitely follow the publication submission guidelines, but it can also help to drop a note to the editor of that section and let them know that you've submitted. My final tip is to be persistent. Unlike, for example, the peer review process, the turnaround for op-eds is super fast, usually days to weeks. So if your piece doesn't land in one place, then try again and again and again. And I would really encourage you to pick publications that are suited for your purposes rather than the publication that is the most prestigious. That is not only going to help you be more successful in your pitching process, but it's also going to help you achieve the goal of writing the op-ed in the first place, which is to speak out for and advocate for the changes that you want to see. For the piece that I referenced in this video, I really wanted to target a campus publication because I had the most to say about what was happening on campus. Kind of similarly, for my classmate, she's really involved in violence prevention and recovery programs within Chicago. So she targeted a Chicago publication so that she could speak more specifically about the tools, programming, and resources for violence prevention within Chicago. So those are all the tips that I have for you today. Please let me know if you have any questions about anything I said in the comments. I'm wishing you the best of luck in writing and publishing your own op-eds. Thank you so much for watching, and thanks so much to Skrintal for sponsoring this video. See you guys next time.